God puts us in nations, in places, not by mistake, but to do a job. What if we opened our eyes to the needs of our colleagues, of our leaders, of our subordinates, and we were a priest on their behalf? Welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. My name is Brett Johnson.
And I'm Lynn Johnson.
And we're going to be talking about how to get our business into God's business. Our subtext is Let My Business Go, and we'll have guests from around the world. So thank you for joining us this week and every week on the Repurposing Business Podcast. Well, welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. My name is Brett Johnson, and I'm here with André Holtshausen. And André, welcome.
Thank you very much, Brett.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah, I first met André in South Africa. At the time, André was CEO of a company called PayProp in Stellenbosch, a lovely part of South Africa, I must say. And you must have had some of the best located corporate offices in the country.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, many people are envious of those of us that can actually work in Stellenbosch.
Yeah,
when you have that privilege. So yeah. Indeed. Yeah.
But you're not in Stellenbosch any longer, André.
No. Actually, I'm now based in the UK. Our offices here is in a little town called Sevenoaks, which actually have many of the same characteristics, excluding the mountains and the wine. But in terms
of the weather, what about the weather?
I've given up on that, Brett. No, but it's not that bad at all. But it's a nice little town which we enjoy living in. So yeah, this is where I am.
Fantastic. And how long have you been in the UK for?
Approaching 4 years. Yeah, we came over August 2017. Yeah, much of that has been in lockdown, but I guess is what it is.
Yeah. So, André, tell us a bit about your background and your journey, and what you studied and how you ended up in the business that you're in.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my background, obviously grew up in South Africa, went on studying at Stellenbosch to become a chartered accountant, qualified with what was then Coopers & Lybrand way back then, so that gives my age a bit, and then went on to secondment with them to London, when the merger happened. So I effectively worked for PwC in London at the back end of the 90s, mainly in the financial services sector in London. So that was quite exciting as a young professional. Moved on to work for one of our ex-audit clients in the London environment, in the insurance intermediary world. And we'll talk about that on another day. But in terms of had great exposure to traveling around the world in that role, and then went back to South Africa, and that was quite a significant point. And I don't know how much detail you want us to go into that, but I guess in terms of the subject that we're talking about, there's probably three key events that therefore play a role in where I find myself today. So perhaps it is relevant.
Tell us a bit about those things.
Yeah. So I guess there's probably a fourth, because if I go back way to when I was saved and became a follower of Jesus at the age of 15 or something like that, the next thing that happened was that I became very aware that I'm going to be an accountant for God. So after that, there wasn't really much hard work to choose subjects at school and know where I'm going to study. But that was really the route. And then obviously because of that juncture, I've always been either a treasurer of an outreach group or a church. I mean, that's just how it happens, isn't it? When you're accountant, that's what you get. And so I did a lot of that. Then in 2001, on a retreat while we were living in the UK, I got a very clear vision from God that I will be involved in repurposing finances or releasing kingdom finance for expansion of the kingdom. I obviously didn't know quite okay, what does this mean, Lord? At the time, I was quite involved in a number of mission outreaches from church and other organizations. So that really was my context at the time. And then sort of move on a few years. So come to 2006, which was a big moment for us. I was working in London, doing really well, enjoyed that juncture, and as a family actually starting to grow. And we were just at the time thinking about buying a bigger property. And both Annalisa and myself, in separate revelations from the Lord, just heard the message that the money I've given you or enabled you to save is not for a new property, it's for something else. Wow. So we started to pray around that. So the next instruction I got was to resign my job in London, which was a strange instruction and quite challenging. I was tied into some long-term incentives plans, so all of that just didn't make sense. But that's perhaps too a long story for another day. But nevertheless, was convinced by the Lord to resign without knowing what's coming next. We went through that journey, which created immense opportunity for testimony at work with my senior colleagues. It's a funny story I often tell people, because when I put my resignation in, CEO called me in next day, and as I walk into his office, he said to me, because I was led by the Lord to also put in my resignation that I'm called by the Lord to do something else. He called me in, and as I walked into his office, he said, "You bloody Christians, we should throw all of you to the lions." That was his words to me. But anyway, so that started a bit of a journey to then see where the Lord wants to take us, and that caused me to join the organization I'm part of today. At that juncture, I was actually journeying with them probably for 4 years. It's so the base of our company is a company called Give and Gain, which is today an international platform for donor management and fundraising events, etc., etc. And out of that grew the organization, which is PayProp. So we use the same technology to offer a solution into the lettings or property management industry. And I went back to South Africa to join them as an organization, which still today runs off the basic principle that it's more blessed to give than to receive. That was the foundations of Give and Gain. Carried that into the PayProp business. So I helped establish the business in South Africa for that. And then we started to expand internationally. And in 2017, the group asked me to move to the UK to oversee the activity that we run here.
So André, unpack Give and Gain a little bit. You just touched on that. So can you unpack that a little?
Yeah, so Give and Gain was started by two brothers who really had the passion to I mean, today we call it sort of one word, zero barriers. And what happened for them was the younger brother was working in the US at the time. He was trying to send back some money to his mum's church in South Africa and found it so difficult to transfer $500 from one part of the world to the other. And seeing all the costs that was lost in the process, that they said, okay, this is it. This is what we need to try to solve. And Give and Gain was born, and it became at first just it was a platform for charities. It's way ahead of its time. So we had to do everything for charities, give them communication capability with mass email and text capabilities, to build websites, because all of those services were not available.
Right. This is way before your Kivas and your TransferWise and all of
and your MailChimps and you name it, everything that started to come across, and the guys that build web pages and all of that. So over the years, actually, we've started to switch off the non-core stuff that wasn't us. So did integrations with other services as they came about. But the key thing was to try to make it easier for givers and for charities to reach their donors, and for donors to get money to charities, and for charities to tell their stories. That was really what was a key element.
And can people still sign up for that today? And
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. So now today, I mean, Give and Gain is a foundation based in Switzerland. We collect donations in all currencies because it's just a card transaction. Doesn't matter where in your world you are. to support a charity, and then we distribute the funds to wherever those charities are. We're slightly different to some of the other fundraising or crowdfunding platforms in that on GivenGain, you need to be a registered charity, whatever that means in the geographical space you find yourself. So we validate the causes that receive money through the platform. So that creates a bit of a credibility there. It's not just anyone that is going after the world to give them money, because I could tell you that side of the story as well. Over there's amazing things that happen.
Yeah. I mean, this is a world that's fraught with issues, the raising of funds and then the transfer of funds. And it's interesting that you came at it from the charity angle and then built out from there.
Yeah, so we often say that it's, I mean, we have found that while we service the charities today, it's really a fundraising platform. So we have lots of partnerships with event organizers. The Boston Marathon, for example, is a key event that's currently live on at the moment on GivenGain. And many of the runners use the platform, therefore, to raise funds for the charities of their choice. So we have shifted the focus a lot where the charities are still the beneficiaries of what happens there. A lot of our effort is engagement with the fundraisers and the event organizers and the events.
So sports figures and event organizers and others who want to pass on to even American Idols, probably, if they designated charity. I know that was a thing in South Africa at some point.
That could happen. You're right.
That's right. Fantastic. So then you move on to PayProp. And what is PayProp doing as an organization?
So PayProp offers a automated transaction platform for the property management industry. Got slightly different terminology in the different parts of the world. It's the lettings industry in the UK. So anywhere where a tenant needs to pay money and that money needs to arrive with a landlord, and in between something needs to happen with that money. So that could be the commission that goes to the property manager, or the management fees, or any other expenses that may be settled. Sometimes there are contractor fees to be paid or utilities to be paid. And we've created a platform that enables the property managers to manage all of that, together with all the communications and reporting that you would expect within that transaction cycle.
Sounds easy, but I remember when we moved to the States, after some years, we bought a house and we had a third mortgage on the house, let alone a first and a second. So the couple we bought the house from moved out of California to Oregon, and we paid them a monthly amount, sort of interest only. And but getting the money from California to Oregon, they wanted me to go into the bank every month with a letter to get it approved, because it was an interstate transfer. I mean, you wouldn't believe what a nightmare it was.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, Brett, when you start to move into that space. And we were fortunate in a way that we started out in South Africa, and it may surprise many people that South Africa is quite advanced in terms of its banking. Or at least when we started in the start of the 2000s, what we could do in terms of banking connectivity and the speed of transactions was quite advanced. Even to the extent that when we then brought the concept to the UK in, I think 2010 was probably the first time we started to have conversations here, the banks here told us, what you're trying to do is not possible.
Right.
And we said, well, it is, because we're doing it. You just need to figure out how we're going to do it with you. It took a bit of time for the UK's faster payment concept to be built out. And finally, the banking rails in the UK became available for us to do what we were doing in other parts of the world. Then jumping over the pond, as they say, to get into Canada and the US, yet another story, as you quite rightly say. So the US have a very different banking setup because of all the states and the fact that you don't necessarily have that connectivity. So it's an interesting world for us to and teaches us a lot about how we interact with the different payment environments. And it's obviously today an area that is fast growing with various changes in protocol and standards coming into place, and it's really a wave that's coming from Europe through the UK and hitting the US fast in terms of a new ISO standard that determines the same format of transactional data exchange between financial institutions, so which effectively means that in the past, where you may have had to build a specific integration with a bank, understanding their file structure, what's starting to change is if you adopt the ISO standard, then you should be able to just shift your file from one bank to the other, and it wouldn't make a difference. So it's fast changing, allowing a lot of fintech opportunities into the space.
Fascinating. So, André, along the way, you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of finance. Clearly I'm older than you because I was with Price Waterhouse, back in the day. We actually looked at a merger with Deloitte back in the day. We were down looking at actual shared office space sharing clients, and then it got nixed by the London partners, actually. And you could see why, given the size of the firms there. But that was, pre-PwC. And but you've got to see, working in financial services, and London is such a hub for financial services. People in North America don't understand that, there is New York, but a lot of what happens, I find what happens in financial services in London reaches into the world quite extensively. Now, you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And what are some of the things in the world of capital markets, capital finance, that have concerned you, that have made you think, okay, this is something we need to fix because it's just not right?
Yeah, that's interesting, Brett. And there's probably a few things that may sound completely disconnected, but in my mind and in where I've written things down, these things do come together. And one of the things, for example, was that way back when I got the calling from the Lord in 2001, I was at PwC at the time, who was an organization that at that time had a turnover of about 60 billion pounds, dollars a year. And I was looking at that, and it had about 66,000 employees worldwide. And at the same time, the evangelical mission world had a similar turnover. And I was looking at that and thinking, I don't see that impact. I don't see an kingdom impact at the same level as a PwC is doing globally, because obviously it's one of the big firms that's making. So that got me going in a certain ways to say, okay, something is wrong here. Then from a completely different angle, because of that passion, then seeing the waste and the inappropriate application of funding when it comes to support. And an example would be, I led a team to Lesotho way back in 2005, where we were going to help on an agricultural project there. And two critical observations there for me that stood out was, the first thing I did in terms of preparing the team to take them to Lesotho, I did a bit of research about the country and what is the need and why are we going there and what should happen. And it became clear to me that if you take all the money that flows from Europe and the US into Lesotho and you just equally distribute that amongst the just over 2 million people, there will be no one in poverty.
Right.
So then you say, okay, I'm not taking this team to Lesotho because something else is wrong. But anyway, we got to Lesotho, and then close to the place where we were, we drive past this equipment yard in one of the villages close to where we went for this agricultural project. And there are state-of-the-art agricultural equipment stacked up in this thing. And I'm asking the guy working with her, what's that? Some rich place in the US donated completely inappropriate agricultural equipment for Lesotho. It's never going to be used because the tractors can't work in the mountains. They're not geared for that. So they're just going to go for waste. And at the point, the grass was as tall as you could already there. So you see all of this and you're just saying, somewhere we've lost the purpose of how all of this is to happen. Now, from a completely sort of capitalist point of view, you're absolutely right. If you operate in a place like London, you just see the bad side of it. I mean, how people go about wealth creation, the inequality when it comes to what people earn. And some of the conversations I've been, I don't know whether it's a privilege, perhaps it is, I've been part of in boardrooms where you just hear conversations saying, well, that doesn't make sense. We can't be debating that in terms of a single person's remuneration when the counter side is there. So greed has got hold of what happens in London to such an extent that the true impact of what wealth creation should be able to do is just completely lost.
Has that greed become, is there lipstick on that greed? Has it become sanctioned? Does it just become normal part of the London financial services way of life? So it's accepted, people are dull to that?
Absolutely, it is. And you know what happens, Brett, is that we cover it by all the good we do.
Okay.
Yeah. So it is all right to operate like that because I am involved in a charity here on the side, or I'm sleeping on a pavement. I mean, there's this thing in the UK at the moment. The CEOs of companies go and sleep on the pavement for a night in the middle of the winter to show how much they care for the homeless.
Yeah.
Really? Is that what it's about? So we have created events and activity that is masking our lack of proper stewardship to show something to the world that make it feel all right. There's that, and then I think there's also another element which is probably where I'm not the authority on this, and I can't really say this is how we change it, but certainly an awareness that there's a level of defeatism by those who believe, who work in those structures, are prepared to benefit from those structures, and then needs to find another place to apply it. So I think there's a significant opportunity for a voice within that environment, but it's not spoken. So in that sense, we've allowed what has been developed and become the center of the world to operate in that way. And it's almost as if we say, that's what it is. We can't change that. So we'll just benefit to it, and then we'll turn around and do some good somewhere else. And hopefully that's all right then, to live within that space. I don't know whether that makes sense. Or
no, it does. It does make sense. And it's, I think I saw some of that mindset in some of the Southeast Asia countries where what I saw there was you could have the owner of a company, and the CEO was a hired professional, and the owner of the company might be a crook and might condone bribery and so on. And the working professional said, yeah, but the Bible says I must do what my master tells me to do. And it's an extreme case, but I mean, I actually had people, bank CEOs tell me that. And there's also, as you say, the defeatism. We don't believe that God wants to change the system. I'm interested to hear that at 15 or so, you felt that God wanted you to be an accountant, which you figured out God's an accountant. That's fantastic. And so you're in the same business as God. But the reality is, if you don't believe God is in finance, you wouldn't think about changing financial systems and financial structures. And so we end up with this bifurcated life, this dichotomized life where, and, for all of the talk of kingdom business, the world of capital has been largely untouched, in my view, in terms of the mechanisms, the processes, not the intention. I think there's a groundswell of people who want to do good with money.
Yes.
And, good capital, social capital, patient capital, impact investing, all of these things, but still out of the old system, and few who want to say, okay, now there's got to be a better system. So I'm interested to hear that.
Yeah, that is, you're right. And I mean, sometimes I wonder, again, seeing it from a different angle in other places, I do, and I don't want to give him too much credit, but I do think the enemy allows us to, or has enabled, is bring division in relationships. That was his first thing he did, wasn't it? So he's got centuries on us in terms of experience in doing that. And I think that is one of the things that we find is that the network, I mean, the kingdom capacity that sits within the hand of kingdom-minded people is immense. Some of that is starting to surface, as you say, in terms of good capital and where people are starting to apply themselves and talk about that. But even there, I don't think we've been able to establish that network of people to talk to each other and actually realize my brother next to me has, I mean, he's sitting in the same framework that I'm in, but he also have a passion to bring change to how that is being deployed and how it's being applied.
Yeah.
I also sometimes wonder, Brett, whether the even for us, the teaching that we get from the Bible is so much focused on the giving, the tithing at the end sometimes, but also there's the first fruits, that element, but it doesn't focus on where does it start.
Yes.
So when we get our first commission to co-create with God and to multiply, I mean, I do actually believe that it doesn't just mean get children. It is multiply, co-create with God, continue to create. So I think that's something that we miss when we're trying to apply how should our involvement with God in continuing to create, in generating wealth. It starts there. It doesn't actually start once you have it. Now decide how you give on it. And therefore, so when I pray, I don't only want to pray to God, what should I do with what you've given me? But how do I make more of what you've given me? And in that regard, when you try to translate that into how we deploy capital and how do we enhance and grow the capital, that is something that I think I haven't mastered yet, and I'm still trying to figure out. But what does it mean as God as our main shareholder in how we think about capital and how we think about how we apply it, and even to some extent that you may get a situation where you're spiritually led by God to grab something that on paper looks like the lesser opportunity that's in front of you. But because spiritually and convinced by the Holy Spirit, God is leading you into that one. Then there's a deeper purpose that we still may need to understand. And then we also need to be bold enough to say that the outcome of that may not necessarily be monetary, but there may be a bigger impact. So is there something like something that may not be as profitable, but is completely going to transform a society? Is there an investment that will do that? You know, and I think that's the interconnectivity of capital with the other spheres around us. I think is the bit that needs development and needs some thinking and thought.
When I wrote the book Repurposing Capital, one of the things I was aware of was that the Muslims were more integrated in their thinking, and they used capital to disciple. It was part of it. And part of it was the way a deal was set up. So if I borrowed money from a bank in the US, they would look at my collateral. They might even hope that I go belly up because the collateral is bigger than the loan. Then they get a better asset for the old asset, you know, if they were mean. But, you know, the risk is on me. In the case of some of the Islamic finance, they will go in as a partner, an equity partner, if you like. And their payback is dependent on your success. And therefore, they have to keep coaching you, mentoring you, helping you up your game. So there's a greater connection between capital and discipling. I think you talked about the giving part. I think the other part of capital that Christians talk to is the whole notion of debt forgiveness every 50 years or every 7 years, year of Jubilee, which is a little bit pie in the sky in some respects. And I think it's also become disconnected from the discipling element. In other words, I think built into that, if you've got a farm in Stellenbosch and I've got the farm next door, my farm is pitiful and yours is flourishing, and you buy my farm and you put in fertilizer and you send trained workers to prune my vines and you do all of that kind of stuff, you're going to do it based on how many years until you've got to give it back, right? But basically, it's an upskilling thing. You're going to teach me to be a better farmer. So there was a built-in upskilling program into the nation of Israel so that they become better and better. I would rise to your level unless I wanted to be your servant forever, you know, but it would produce a nation of upskilled entrepreneurs. And so I think we've lost that connection between capital and the development of people, of businesses, and so on.
Yeah, I think the moment that it switches into a true slavery situation, I mean, that I think is the balance that you need to find, because it's I guess forever going to be like that there are people that are progressing or needing help from others, as you say. Let's call it discipleship. And how do I disciple them? It's in everything that they do. It's that complete stewardship of what they have. And if that means I'm in a coaching stage for a part of my life, and I do believe we all should really be there forever, because do we ever arrive? I mean, so there's constantly new things for us to explore and learn about, and the possibility to turn around and to coach others. So I think that, but it shouldn't become an imbalance. It shouldn't become a situation of it's almost more a father-son principle than it is a master-slave principle. I mean, it's the principle that I'm passing on what I have, and I'm helping people to reach their potential, for people to see where God is leading them, So the moment it becomes a situation, whether that's debt or whether that's a situation where I've invested into someone else's business, but if it reaches a point where they can't escape that, and it captures them in a negative way, then I seriously have to ask myself a question. I mean, I'm sitting in a situation where we employ people, and the critical thing for them is that they need to find their joy where they do their work. They need to find their purpose where they do their work. If they, at any point in time, they may be my best employee, but if their call is somewhere else, or there's a different and a better place for them to reach their potential, then we should be the first people to release them.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that the same thing needs to be in our mind whenever we think about working with capital as well. Yes, capital have a purpose where you need to help someone out with that, and yes, you're expecting a return on that. But the moment it enslaves, then we've got it wrong. And I think that's
how does this translate over, Andre, to PayProp and the property market? Because often it's a space where you've got landowners and you've got tenants, and is PayProp able to help tenants think more like owners and transition them out of the rental bucket? And I know with millennials, there's fewer of them actually wanting to buy properties, right? It's not like when you were young, it was like become a chartered accountant, get a wife, get a house, in whatever order.
Yeah, you're right, Britton. And I guess the immediate answer is, I don't think we've figured it out yet.
Yeah.
As to how do we play a part in that. Your second point about that the market around is changing. I mean, I wrote something yesterday on where I was asked to comment on how do we see the market going forward. And I mean, there is a reality that for many people, property is something I consume. It's not something I want to own anymore. So it almost starts to shift to a space where certain people decide I'm into property as an asset class, and therefore I'm also going to own my property. But you're absolutely right. The younger generation is saying, I want to be flexible. I want to be able to move around. I've got a fairly senior colleague who owns a lot of property, but not the one he lives in.
Yeah.
He rents, because the other is part of his investment. That's his asset class. But and he wants the flexibility to not be tied down into a property. So the question is, so how do we play a part in that? I mean, I think that that's still something for us to figure out. How do we enable the tenant to be in a better position if that is where they want to go? We're actually at the moment talking about. I mean, there's one element of capital that sits around completely unproductive, and that's just all the tenant deposits that you find in the world. I mean, everywhere you go, a tenant pays something. In Canada, it's typically used as the last month's rent, for example. So you pay 2 months worth, and the last part of it's used for the last month's rent, and so you get.
And in some countries, you have to pay a year in advance.
Exactly. Yeah. Switzerland, I know, has 3 months worth of rental value as a deposit that you put down, and that money because it's sort of held in trust, call it that. It's got different names in different places in the world, but by the property managers, it's also an area of significant fraud around the world, and that's certainly where PayProp plays a role with transparency and the way we report on stuff, so that it's really not possible to defraud tenants on the deposit management. But still, it's a huge amount of capital that's just sitting there, completely unproductive. Yeah. And currently, we're starting to say, well, it is the tenants' money. How do we help them to use that money while it's sitting there and I'm living in the property and no one can touch it because I'm in my tenancy? How do we help the tenant to grow that so that he's got a bigger asset when he comes out of the property? Yeah. So trying to think in that direction, but we're not there yet. Yeah.
So I can see a new PayProp cryptocurrency coming out soon. Yeah. It's interesting on this question of the difference between the promised land and, say, Egypt, or we say Egypt, but of course it goes back to a Babylonian system, and many of the early banks actually being temples and then different mediums of exchange. But as Israel got out of the slavery mindset that had perpetuated Egypt, perhaps thanks to Joseph, that's one of my questions for God. Did Joseph deliberately cripple the Egyptian economy through the slavery mindset? But as God talks about the promised land, he promises to give them this combination of capital and faith, and they have to learn to steward capital. And part of the problem is that they've had 40 years in the desert living hand to mouth, which is what we Christians call the life of faith. You depend on God every day for the manna, for the quail, for the water. Yeah. And done. But you never have to put a hoe in the ground. You never have to prune a grapevine, and you never have to fertilize a peach tree, But the promised land is different. You've got this combination of capital and faith. Yeah. And I think we're so stuck in it's capital or faith. Versus how do you combine those things? So I'm interested to hear any thoughts you have on teaching people to steward capital. When you talked about the ability to create wealth, it's God who gives us the ability to create wealth and so confirms his covenant with us. So it's part of the mark of the covenant that we are wealth creators in the image of God. We are expansionists. We're able to create wealth. And you've got a database of tenants who by some degree are stuck in a particular way of thinking, in a slavery mindset versus an ownership mindset. And so quite a huge opportunity you have there, André.
Yeah. But it's interesting, Brett, because I could then also challenge that to say, is that our paradigm? Is it our paradigm that the tenant is necessarily a slave to the property owner? Because it may be by choice. I mean, we now have Uber in the world. So many people are saying, I don't need a car.
That's true.
Because there's public transport that will take me where I need to go. So I think there's possibly that as well, that it's what do we need to do about our paradigm, and do we label them incorrectly by thinking they feel enslaved by being a tenant? I mean, that may be absolutely their free choice.
I guess it's back to your choice of what's a productive use of capital, right? Are they deploying capital and looking at capital broadly, intellectual, spiritual, relational, all this kind of stuff? And if renting an apartment or a flat in London gives them flexibility on the other things, and they're able to deploy capital better, that's one thing. If they simply are consuming, so this is are you just being debt and consumption driven, or are you actually redeploying capital deliberately by choice?
Yeah, that's right. So back to this example of one of my colleagues who then says, but actually the properties I rent out pay more than the rent I have to pay for the property I've chosen to rent instead of chosen to own. But there's something else, Brett, that I often wonder about. I mean, there's direction for us, certainly in Scripture, about first fruits and tithing and all of that. So what to do with part of what we've been blessed with. There's very clear instruction that we should be, shall I say, careful of money because of the risk that brings in terms of sin. there's clear instruction that we should be working with the capital, I believe,
yes,
to continue to create and all of that.
mm.
Nowhere do I see something that says, and when you do it well, your return is 10%, or when you do it well, your return is 50%. There's no definition actually in monetary terms that I could see so far, but I don't profess to be have a doctorate in that study at all. And somehow it feels to me like, is God just saying to me, just be obedient and follow my instruction and how you deal with that. It's almost as if you talk about the journey and that God's provision to Israel as they were journeying to the promised land. There's almost something to me, and this is potentially dangerous territory because it could sound like people could go into prosperity gospel and all of that. So for me, there's almost a bit of a disconnect there. There is no direct connection between how I steward capital and the return I'm getting out of that. I don't see any promise that there is a direct correlation. What I do see is God's promise that he's eternally my provider. And part of that is my obedience in everything that I do for him. So not to disconnect capital completely with the faith journey I have, but not to think that successful stewardship of my capital is evidenced by the margin of return.
Right.
Because the margin of return is not necessarily measured in monetary terms.
Yeah, and I think the world is grappling with this, Andre, in terms of the whole ESG thing, for example. You know, it used to be corporate social responsibility, corporate social investments, etc. Now we've got the environmental, social, and governance categories.
Yeah.
So companies need to, you know, produce a return, but not harm the environment and have some social impact and have some decent level of transparency, which is a bit of a joke in some respects. And it's become... whenever something like this pops up, then the enemy tries to hijack it, you know. So you've got the tree hugger, Mother Earth thing. Not to say we shouldn't be stewards, you know. I believe we should be stewards, but that agenda can hijack it, or whatever your social cause is, good, bad, or ugly, hijacks it. And the governance thing is often not understanding of the cultures in which things operate and how they operate. So, but the fact is, people are still trying to ask this question: what's the connection between capital and a more full return, a sort of a bouquet of returns that's not just financial stuff? It's good that people are asking that question. And the ultimate question we're asking is, okay, what's the connection between the handling of capital and all of that stuff and eternity? Because, you know, just this week I was reading where Jesus says, look, you know, you shouldn't work for food that just work for food. You should work for an eternal return. You know, there's this notion that what you do today has an impact on eternity. And so finding the metrics for that.
No, I fully agree with that. And there's some time ago I was sort of battling with this whole concept of what is fair profitability, for example. And we know that depending on the industry and depending on where you find yourself, I mean, a good margin may be 10%, but in some others, I mean, 50, 60% is not unheard of. And I was really struggling with that to say, well, can that be fair then? And I really felt that the Lord was saying to me, André, it's not about the margin. It's about what you do with the margin. And so therefore the redeployment of that in obedience to what the Lord is asking us to do, that's one element for me. The other element that just recently read again through Luke, when Jesus tells the parable about the master that goes away to get his kingship, and the minas that they hand out, and we know the story about the different return on that. And what I love about that story is that, I mean, the first guy that Jesus reports about in this parable is that he makes another 10, so that's 11. There's actually no talk there that it was taken away from him. He was just given 10 cities to go and look after. The guy with 5 gets another 5, so he's got 6, but he keeps the 6. He just gets 5 cities to go and look after. So the excitement of being invited by God to be part of what he does, and then to say, if you obey and do well in the small, I can get you involved in more of what I do.
Yeah.
Is to a certain extent for me the connection, but that is dangerous ground for not having an eternity mindset, because if we're then going to try to measure it in do I see today, is the blessing there today, what does it mean here today?
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say, I sometimes think there's clearly a long way for me to go in my faith journey, because when I see some of the hardship that other people need to go through for their faith, I'm thinking, whew, I don't think I've got that yet, and perhaps I'm still working with my one mina, and I still need to prove that I can handle the 5. And I think that is something that I don't know quite where that comes in, but the disconnect that has been created, not only in capital, but in other things, between our faith and our living in the current times, with in a broken reality, with eternity coming, that will still have work, that because God established that obviously before the fall. We all know that. So I think there's, you can clearly hear I've got some way to go to try to understand and see how this becomes practical for us on a day-to-day basis.
One of the earlier speakers, Uli Koch, was talking about the notion of basing a currency, the value of a currency, because often when you're trading between countries, and the currency risk and the difference in currency is just inequitable, just right from the get-go. So he talked about that there's a way to measure GDP differently for every country. So one country is rich in land, another one's rich in bananas, or another one's rich in gold, and so forth. And so having metrics that are valuable, if you like, across the GDP of different countries. And so this notion of measuring things different and differently, is I think an important one. And you mentioned the stewardship of capital, and I think the under stewardship of capital is a big giant in society. It's a big problem. And so getting a sense of God's measure on capital. I remember years ago reading a book, Money Won't Make You Rich. And the guy, Sunday Adelaja, God rebuked him one day. He was leading a church of 15,000 people, and God told him, "You're worse than the unprofitable servant." And he said, "I'm the pastor of 15,000 people." He said, "Yeah, but the offerings come in and the money goes out. At least the unprofitable servant preserved capital. You don't even." And then he began to learn from God and began to teach people. This was in the Ukraine. He was a Nigerian living in the Ukraine. Teach his congregation to build capital little by little and bit by bit. And which requires some new thinking about capital preservation, capital growth.
It's a lovely story, Brett. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's a lovely story that makes me think of a young man who he started agriculture in South Africa, was called to go and work in Africa, joined one of the mission organizations, and I think he ended up in Zambia somewhere. But he was an entrepreneurial guy, and he was really skilled in his trade and all of that. And then got a lot of funding for building a school in a very remote part of Zambia, where they were also running an orphanage from a big US donor. And he ended up using the money, and he built an office block in the capital to the outcry of many. So the money was intended for the school. And he said, but now I have money forever. Because with the first return out of the property, I've built the school. And the running cost for the school is funded out of the continuous management of that property. And I just thought, well, that is just such a beautiful story of integrating our thinking in terms of what it means to follow where the Lord takes us, and to steward well what he puts into our hands. And I mean, I'm involved here and there with conversations around I mean, we often talk about kingdom bank or Christian bank. Can a bank be Christian, and what would it look like if you go into that territory? What does it look like when you manage capital on a kingdom basis? And it's interesting when you then find in that debate how people are trying to say, well, I still have to have a business, otherwise there's no point in doing this. So how do I plug it into a system which seems to enslave me, but are able to offer a kingdom? I can't go and redesign the SWIFT payment network that runs all of the money that moves around the world,
right?
Or can I?
Yeah.
So is that kind of thing. Is so do you start to say, well, those are the rails. The rails in itself are not evil. I mean, those are tools. Those are mechanisms that enable us to operate. So how do we bring heart to what we do on those routes? And for me, certainly, is not to shy away from declaring that. I don't think it's to say, yeah, okay, we will be kingdom principles here in the background and everything we think and do about, but publicly we will just look like any other bank.
Yeah, I can see why banks kept that public face historically, because you want to serve a broad audience, and that's fine, provided the culture that you lived in is predominantly a Christian culture and everybody understands.
Yeah,
that's where it's coming from. But when I was studying for the Repurposing Capital book, my issue was you can't say to a Jew, well, this is what the Christian scripture says, or to a Muslim, this is what the Jewish scripture says, or to a Jew, this is what the Quran says. You have to go back to something bigger. And so I ended up back at the heart of God and the ways of God. So if there was a law, let's call it a law, about giving 10%, well, what's the heart of God behind the law? God is generous. So the principle is one of generosity, however it works out, whether it's corporate social responsibility or your BEE scorecard in South Africa, or whatever, there's a principle of generosity. Or, okay, scripture says you can't keep somebody's cloak overnight, right? So what's the heart of God and the ways of God? You can't take away certain things, and consumption debt versus production debt, things like that. So as your point is getting back to the heart of things, so can you have a bank that operates with the heart of God and with the ways of God, and not a new set of Christian rules for banking?
Yeah, you know what, Brett, and I mean, I think we will have many examples when you talk about that, is that the true heart of God attracts people. So the principles that is true there is not foreign to the human heart.
Right.
So if I look at the principles of what God is about, and I can embody that in the way I live, that just by the nature of who God is, attracts people to him for his glory. I mean, I remember reading an article from forget the name of the guy now, but he was a writer for the Times, and he was clearly, I mean, he didn't believe in it. It was very, very common in his declarations. Whenever he wrote about church, he was very clear. Then he did a tour of Africa. And when he came back, one of the important things he said, the only place that he found joy and hope was where the church was in charge of the community. And that was an interesting observation from a non-believer, just to say that where the true heart of God is visible, there's joy and hope. And for me, that principle sort of comes through to the way we can do business as well. I mean, our own business has truth and care as our foundational values.
Right.
That through repurposing work with you have translated what we do into what does it mean for people. So yes, we do transactions accurately, but what is that? It's truth. And you know what, believer or non-believer, truth and care is fine. They can absolutely associate with that. And so I think you're absolutely right. If we don't need to say this is Christian doctrine or Jewish or Muslim, it is going back to the true heart of God, and that finds embodiment, and then it doesn't matter. People associate with that because of who God is. I mean, he reaches out to people's hearts, and
So in some respects, if people can interact with PayProp or with a bank or with whoever, and they can feel the heart of God through the interaction, they can see the ways of God through the interaction, and they feel loved, cared for, nurtured, built up, whether they remain a tenant their whole life, whether they are dealing with a credit card or a mortgage or a business loan or a capital investment. If it comes wrapped in the truth of God, the grace of God, the love of God, without a sting in the tail, without a gotcha over there. If it comes, then those people are going to be more amenable to truth and more aware of what the kingdom of heaven is like.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, André, thank you for sharing your journey with us. Greatly appreciate it. And I can see you're a man who thinks a lot about these things. And you're right, we have a long way to go in thinking through, how is this thing that I do, this product I put together, this piece of software I put together, the way I serve my customers, how is that producing not just a pie in the sky when you die, eternal return, but how is it also making people aware of how the economy of God, the heart of God, the ways of God, how those things operate today. So it's good to see you thinking those things through and reminding everybody, God is an accountant.
Thank you very much, Brett. Yeah, just from my side, I mean, it's such a privilege just to be on this journey with you. I mean, we learned so much from you. So thank you for being such a student of this repurposing of everything, really. So I learn a lot.
Good. Thank you, André. Thank you so much. And we look forward. We might circle back in a couple of months and just see if we can gain any more insights from you on a panel as we wrap this thing up. But in the meantime, thank you so much, and greatly appreciate your contributions today.
Thank you very much, Brett.